It's hard to explain what it feels like when 15 years of your life get reduced to a 20-minute meeting. But that's where this story begins. Logan Pierce had been the senior systems engineer at St. Joseph Medical Center, a mid-sized hospital tucked in the heart of Missouri. He wasn't flashy. You'd probably pass by him in the hallway and not even notice. But for 15 years, Logan was the invisible thread holding the hospital's technology together. He didn't talk much in meetings. He wasn't the kind to raise his voice or fight for credit. But when something broke, when power flickered during a storm or the pharmacy interface stalled 5 minutes before surgery, it was Logan they called. And it was Logan who showed up. Always, he gave that place everything. And I don't just mean long hours or clever code, I mean missed birthdays. I mean leaving dinner half-eaten when his phone buzzed. I mean the kind of quiet sacrifices that never make it into performance reviews. But things changed. And like most big changes, it didn't come with a warning. Just a calendar invite, director check-in, set for a Tuesday morning, 9:15 sharp. He walked into the office thinking it was a routine update. Maybe budget talk, maybe another round of cybersecurity reviews. But Blake Monroe, the new hospital director, didn't even ask him to sit. Logan stood there, the door still half open behind him, while Blake leaned back in a chair that used to belong to a man named Dr. Robbins. The old director who'd once told Logan, "We don't need flashy, we need reliable." That kind of leadership was gone now. Blake didn't look up from the folder in front of him when he spoke. "Logan, your methods are outdated, we need to modernize, move forward. I've spoken to Helix Solutions. They'll be overseeing the transition to a full cloud-based system. We appreciate your years here, but it's time for a different direction." Logan said nothing. He just stood there, hands by his sides, the kind of silence that doesn't ask questions because it already knows the answers. Across the room stood a man named Devon, a consultant from Helix. Early 30s, sharp suit, phone in hand like it was part of his anatomy. He didn't look at Logan, he didn't need to. He'd already drafted the LinkedIn post about spearheading digital transformation at St. Joseph. Blake slid a folder across the desk. 2-month severance? Standard non-disclosure, we'll need your credentials before you go. And just like that, 15 years were over. Logan reached up, unclipped his hospital badge. That one small movement, it held so much. He placed it gently on the desk, next to a man who didn't know the difference between a firewall and a folder path. Then he said, quietly, "The master credentials are documented in the secured drive, along with backup protocols and pharmacy integrations." Blake smiled, finally, as if Logan's compliance made the whole thing easier for him. "Glad you're being reasonable about this. Change is hard but necessary." Logan didn't answer. He didn't mention the custom security patches he'd written when ransomware hit back in 2018. Didn't explain how he'd rebuilt the surgical scheduling system from scratch after it crashed during flu season. Didn't bring up the overnight hours when the power grid failed, and he rerouted emergency power to the neonatal wing while the rest of the hospital went dark. He just said, "No. Nothing else," and walked out. They sent security to escort him, as if the man who'd kept their systems alive for over a decade had suddenly become a threat. As he passed the oncology ward, a nurse he knew glanced up. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, then didn't, just looked away. Logan's boots echoed down the hall, one step at a time. Through the cafeteria where he'd once pulled an all-nighter during a software rollout. Past the server room where he'd once slept on the floor, running diagnostics in 4-hour intervals. No applause. No thank you. Just the cold hum of fluorescent lights and a hallway full of turned heads. In the parking lot, he unlocked his truck, slid in slowly. A cardboard box sat beside him. A framed picture of Clara, his late wife. A chipped mug that said System Whisperer. A thumb drive labeled Legacy Docs. He didn't start the engine right away, just sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw clenched, because what do you do when the place that used to need you suddenly doesn't? What do you say when they look at 15 years of vigilance and call it outdated? Logan wasn't angry, not yet. Anger is loud. What he felt was heavier, quieter, a kind of betrayal that didn't scream, It just settled into your bones and made you feel hollow. He started the truck, pulled out onto a road he'd driven every day for a decade and a half, but this time he wasn't heading toward work. He was heading into something else entirely. They thought they were done with him, but they didn't understand what they'd just lost. They didn't know that their entire system, every line of custom code, every undocumented shortcut, every manual override, was built not by Helix, not by some template, but by the man they just walked out the door. And they were about to learn the hard way that there are some things you can't outsource, some roles you can't replace, and some people you never should have underestimated. Logan didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing: they had wanted his absence more than his expertise. And now, they were going to get exactly what they asked for. The silence that followed him out of that hospital, it wasn't surrender. It was the beginning. He didn't go home right away. Logan sat in that parking lot for almost an hour. Just him, the box on the passenger seat, and the hum of a hospital that no longer had space for him. Outside, it was one of those late fall mornings. Cloudy, no wind, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like time itself is hesitating. Eventually, he started the truck. The drive was familiar, too familiar. Left turn past the old train tracks, right at the diner where he used to meet Clara after her chemo appointments. The streets hadn't changed, but something in him had, 15 years. And now just space. He parked in front of the apartment building, climbed the stairs with that same cardboard box cradled in his arms, and stepped into silence. Logan lived alone, not because he wanted to. Clara had passed 8 years earlier. Ovarian cancer. Quick, cruel. The kind of loss that doesn't come with a loud goodbye, just a slow, suffocating fade. They'd picked this place together. A modest second-floor unit with a little balcony that faced west. He used to tell her that sunsets looked better from up there, even though she knew he just liked the quiet. He set the box down on the coffee table, still unopened. The apartment was neat, almost too neat. Everything had a place. Nothing had moved in weeks. He didn't sit right away. He just stood there in the middle of the room, staring at the walls like they were strangers. Then, almost without thinking, he walked over to the bookshelf. Bottom row, behind a stack of old tech manuals, was a small wooden box, dusty, simple, and worn at the corners. Inside was a folded scarf, a faded blue with tiny embroidered flowers. Clara's. She used to wear it on cold nights, wrapped loose around her neck, even indoors. Said it made her feel human again after the sterile brightness of the hospital. Logan sat down. He held the scarf in both hands slowly, as if it might break. And that's when it hit him. Not just the job, not just the insult of being discarded, but the weight of how little anyone had seen what he gave. How easily he had disappeared. He thought about that moment in Blake's office. The consultant with the phone, the fake smiles, the severance package with a non-disclosure clause like a gag order on 15 years of commitment. He had been more than code, more than uptime. He had been trust. The phone on the side table buzzed once. A news alert. He didn't check it. In the kitchen, the coffee pot was still set to brew at 5:30 a.m. A ritual from a life that no longer existed. He left it that way. Maybe part of him hoped tomorrow might look different. He moved to the window, scarf still in hand, and looked out. Across the parking lot, a tree had lost half its leaves overnight. The branches looked like they were reaching out for something they couldn't quite hold on to. Clara used to say that time doesn't move in a straight line. It folds, it circles. Grief, she once told him, is just memory trying to be present. And this wasn't just grief, it was erasure. When you give your life to something quietly without applause, you don't expect a parade when it ends. But you hope. Maybe someone notices. They hadn't. No one had called. Not from HR, not from the board, not even the nurses who used to leave sticky notes on his monitor that said, "Thanks for saving my shift." Maybe they thought he was fine. Maybe they were just afraid to speak up. He sat there a while longer, thinking about the missed vacations. The Christmas Eve when he stayed late to patch a security hole. The night Clara died and he still checked server logs before bed because she had told him, "Keep them safe, I'll be fine." God, he missed her. He missed her in the way you miss air when it's too humid to breathe. He missed her in the space between seconds, where silence lives and doubt settles. There were things he wanted to say, to Blake, to Devon, to the board, but more than anything, he wanted to talk to her. Just one more cup of coffee, one more night on the balcony with her head resting on his shoulder. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest all day. In the corner of the room, a photo sat on the shelf. Him and Clara at the beach, wind in her hair, sun in his squint. That was 15 years ago. Around the same time, he joined the hospital. Funny how life ties moments together like that. He reached into the box on the table, pulled out the System Whisperer mug, and smiled without humor. What had that even meant to them? A nickname? A joke? Something to print on a birthday card? He turned it over, saw the chip in the rim, and thought about all the nights he held that cup like a steering wheel, staring at lines of code, willing the system not to crash. And it never did. Not once under his watch. The irony, of course, was that everything was still working. His system was still alive, but the heart behind it, the man who knew how it breathed, how it panicked, how it failed gracefully, was now gone, and no one had asked why that mattered. He leaned back, the scarf now resting in his lap, and let the quiet stretch out. Outside, a car pulled in. Some neighbor. A life continuing. He thought about turning on the TV, about pouring a drink, about pretending this was just another long weekend. But he didn't. Instead, he stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down a small duffel bag, old habit. Whenever things got too heavy, Clara used to say, "Pack light and breathe." It was her way of telling him, you don't have to fix everything today. Just move. Just do one thing. He didn't know where he'd go, not yet, but he knew he couldn't stay in that silence much longer. It wasn't just the job that had ended. It was the version of him that believed loyalty was a guarantee. That if you worked hard enough, stayed long enough, cared deep enough, someone somewhere would protect that. Turns out that someone has to be you. Logan didn't cry. Not exactly. But his eyes stung in that quiet way that comes when you're not sad. Just tired. Exhausted by being invisible. By being good and quiet and dependable. Only to be told none of it mattered because someone with a better pitched deck said so. The scarf slid from his lap to the floor as he walked into the bathroom, washed his face, looked in the mirror and saw a man not broken, but shifted. Something in him had settled, hardened, or maybe clarified. He didn't know what was next, but he wasn't afraid of being forgotten anymore. Because sometimes the most powerful story begins in the space where everything else falls silent. That space is where Logan now stood, and he was listening. It started small. The first message came just 2 days after Logan left the hospital. It was a simple text, short, almost apologetic, from Alan, one of the younger IT techs. "Hey, sorry to bug you. Quick question. Do you remember the backup schedule for the surgical scheduling database? Can't seem to find the config file." Logan read the message in silence. He didn't respond. Not because he was angry, not because he wanted to make a point, but because his severance package had made it clear any unauthorized assistance could lead to legal action. Helix had made sure of that. Still, the text lingered. Sat there on the screen like a knock at a door he wasn't allowed to answer. The next day, another message came in, this time from Denise, the database administrator. "Hi, Logan. Sorry, this is probably a stupid question. Do you happen to remember where the override protocols are stored for the pharmacy interface? I'm getting strange errors." He didn't reply to her either, but he didn't delete the messages. They sat there, quiet reminders of everything he used to hold in his head like a second language. Not just data or diagrams, but memory, instinct, the muscle memory of a man who had spent 15 years listening to the system breathe. Each day brought another question. Another little panic from someone who now realized that the blueprint wasn't enough. That the person who built the blueprint mattered, and Logan, he just watched, from the quiet of his apartment, coffee cooling on the table, those questions piled up like snow. Gentle at first, then suddenly everywhere. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. Not really. It was something colder, a kind of certainty they hadn't known. Not really. Not what he did. Not how deep it ran. Not how every patch, every interface, every exception rule was written not just for function, but for people. for nurses at 2 a.m. who needed the system to run, for doctors who couldn't afford delays when every second mattered, and now that care was gone. He knew what was coming. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't even pride. It was just the natural consequence of systems being treated like Legos instead of lifelines. Logan didn't gloat, but he didn't feel bad either. He had warned them. Quietly. Repeatedly. But no one had listened. He remembered the meetings where he tried to explain that the pharmacy module had custom hooks to integrate with a now discontinued vendor. That the emergency alert system was tied into an ancient interface, patched across 3 languages. That their entire architecture wasn't plug-and-play, it was handcrafted to survive real-world chaos, but Devon had waved him off. "We've handled migrations before," the consultant had said. "It's all standard stuff, standard." Logan had stayed up 3 nights in a row once, rebuilding that standard stuff after a power surge wiped half the radiology department's queue. He'd driven in during a snowstorm because someone forgot to restart the backup server. And now they were asking about config files. His phone rang one evening, an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. It was Blake. The voice was strained. Polite but pushed. "Logan, we're having some minor hiccups with integration, nothing urgent, just wondering if we could have a quick call, just to clarify a few items." "Would appreciate it." Click. Logan didn't call back. He just sat there in the dark, lit only by the pale glow of his laptop screen. Outside, the streetlights buzzed like they always did. Low, faintly uneven. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else is silent. He sipped his coffee and stared at the screen, at the inbox, at the quiet requests for help dressed up as friendly check-ins. He thought about what Clara might have said, probably something soft, something kind. She had always seen the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. She'd believed that doing the right thing meant something, even if no one saw it. But Logan had done the right thing for 15 years. He'd shown up. He'd stayed late. He'd given everything. And when it came time to choose between profit and people, they chose profit. They always do. The next voicemail came from someone he didn't expect, Dr. Ellen Harper. Her voice was lower, slower. "Logan, I'm so sorry to reach out like this. I just wanted you to know what's happening." She paused. "Today we had a trauma case come in. Young man, early 20s, motorcycle accident. Critical condition." Logan closed his eyes. He knew where this was going. The ER couldn't pull his medication history. Took 40 minutes calling other hospitals. "No allergies on file. We almost administered something that would have killed him." Her voice cracked just a little. "He's okay." "Barely." "But we were blind, and it never used to be like that." Silence followed, then softly. "They're talking about going back to paper records, Logan. Everything's unraveling." The call ended. Logan didn't move. The room was still. Just the soft creak of old floorboards and the distant sound of a train passing miles away. And in that silence, something inside him shifted. Not rage, not even the urge to fix it, just clarity. The kind that comes when all the noise falls away and only the truth remains. He hadn't failed them. They had failed themselves. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark. The hospital was miles away, but he could almost see it. Not the building, but the people. Alan, Denise, the nurses who stayed late, the doctors who ran between departments, the janitors who joked with him during overnight updates. They were the ones paying the price, not Blake. Not Devon. The real work always falls on the ones no one thanks, and Logan knew that's who he'd always done it for, not the executives, not the strategy decks, the people, the ones who cared. His phone buzzed again. Another text. More questions, more desperation. He didn't answer. He just watched the screen fade to black. They were starting to realize you can't replace trust with templates. You can't swap out loyalty like it's a line item on a spreadsheet. And you definitely can't delete 15 years of devotion and expect the system to breathe on its own. Logan had left the hospital, but the hospital hadn't left him. It was unraveling, one unanswered question at a time. There's a difference between being let go and being replaced. And then there's something else entirely, being removed, deliberately, strategically. Like a piece on a board someone wanted cleared long before the first move was made. That was what Logan came to understand. It didn't come from a news report or a sudden realization. It came from a voice he hadn't heard in months, Dr. Ellen Harper. She'd always been one of the steady ones. The kind of doctor who didn't play politics, who remembered birthdays, who called nurses by name, even during emergencies. She and Logan had worked side by side for over a decade. Quiet respect, unspoken trust, so when her name lit up his phone that Thursday afternoon, he didn't let it go to voicemail. Her voice was low. Careful. "Logan," she said, "I need to show you something." They met at a park not far from the hospital. A quiet one, benches shaded by old trees, the kind of place where conversations don't echo. Ellen looked tired, not just from work, but from pretending things weren't falling apart. She handed him a printed email. Folded once, already creased from being opened and closed too many times. Logan unfolded it with slow hands. Read it once, then again. The subject line was simple. Helix Integration Timeline Clearance Plan. It was an internal communication, sent weeks before his termination. And in it, Blake had written to the Helix team. Final step before contract signature. Removal of legacy system dependencies. Phase 1. Off-board LP before Q3. Will position transition as part of modernization strategy. Prepare NDA for legal protection. Board will approve once clearance completed. Logan didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes stayed on that phrase. Off-board LP before Q3. He wasn't a person to them. He was a dependency, a line on a checklist. Ellen leaned forward slightly, her voice hushed. "I found it buried in a shared folder Blake forgot to lock down. I wasn't even looking for this. I was trying to access post-op recovery stats and stumbled onto the Helix project documentation." She looked at him, and for a second, she didn't see the quiet tech guy. She saw the man who'd held the system together, who'd fixed things in silence and been thanked with silence in return. "I had no idea," she said. "None of us did." Logan folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket, still quiet, still listening, but something in his jaw tightened. Because now it all made sense. The sudden audit, the way Devon's team showed up with slick presentations and buzzwords, the hollow smiles, the speed. It was never about his performance. It was never about modernization. It was always about clearing the way. They needed him out because he stood between Blake and a bonus. A performance incentive tied directly to Helix's rollout. Ellen explained what she'd heard, off the record, of course, that Helix had offered the hospital board significant cost reductions on paper, that Blake had promised a seamless transition, that the fine print included a quiet clause. Helix would only provide discounted service if the existing infrastructure, Logan's infrastructure, was fully removed. They needed a clean slate, even if it meant erasing the man who had built everything. Logan didn't flinch, but the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees overhead. Leaves spiraled down onto the table between them. He looked down at one of them. Brown edges, brittle veins, something that had once been part of something vital, now discarded by the season. He knew how that felt. Ellen reached into her bag and pulled out another folder. "This one," she said, "you should really see." Inside were slides from a presentation Blake had delivered to the board. Logan recognized some of the charts, system uptime reports, architecture diagrams, but something was off. The numbers had been altered, benchmarks had been manipulated to make Logan's systems look unstable. Phrases like legacy bottlenecks, critical vulnerabilities, and compliance concerns were highlighted in red. All lies, all part of the narrative. Logan had documentation, real documentation, that showed 99.98% uptime. No critical failures. Full audit compliance, but those numbers weren't what got Blake the deal. Fear did. Fear sells fast. Logan closed the folder and sat back. There was no question anymore. This wasn't incompetence, it was orchestration. Every piece had been moved with purpose, and now the same system they'd gutted was bleeding errors. Departments were reverting to paper. Patient care was suffering. All because someone wanted a line on their resume that read, "led successful digital transformation." Logan looked at Ellen, and for the first time in days, his voice broke the silence. How bad is it really? She didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, critical care has diverted 4 patients this week. 2 surgeries were delayed because of scheduling crashes. There's talk of state compliance stepping in. She hesitated. They're scared, Logan, and they're starting to realize what they lost. He nodded once, not in triumph, not in satisfaction, but in understanding, the kind of understanding that settles not in your mind, but deep in your bones, when you realize the truth always comes out, eventually. Logan left the park with the documents in hand. He didn't rush, didn't call anyone, just walked, letting the gravity of it all settle in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about integrity, about legacy, about what happens when people in charge forget that systems aren't just software and servers. They're the people who keep them breathing, who wake up at 2 in the morning because something doesn't look right on a readout, who care, not because they're paid to, but because they know what's at stake if they don't. Logan went home that evening and sat at his desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a notebook he hadn't touched in months. He flipped to a blank page and started writing, not a plan for revenge, not even a strategy, just a record. A quiet record of everything that had happened, the messages, the voicemails, the data, the lies, because he didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing for certain. This had never been a fair game, and Blake, he hadn't just fired the wrong man. He'd underestimated the one person who knew the system better than anyone, because Logan hadn't just built it. He was the system. And this time, they were going to see what it meant to break it without understanding how it worked. There's a moment in every storm when the wind calms. Not because the chaos is over, but because something has shifted. For Logan, that moment came on a Monday morning. The emails had been piling up, each one from Blake, each one more desperate than the last. They started formal, polite, seeking clarification, minor configuration issues, quick assistance appreciated. Then came the ones with subject lines in all caps, urgent database failure, emergency system downtime. But Logan said nothing. He just read them and then deleted them. What could he say to a man who had looked him in the eye and called 15 years of sacrifice outdated? But that morning, something changed. Logan was standing by the window, mug in hand, watching a soft drizzle roll across the parking lot. The kind of rain that doesn't roar, just whispers against the glass. That's when the doorbell rang. He didn't need to check the peephole. He already knew. Blake stood on his doorstep. No longer the man from the glossy hospital brochure. His tie was crooked, eyes red around the edges, face pale in that way stress pulls at the skin. "Logan," he said, trying to smile. "Thanks for seeing me." Logan stepped aside, didn't say a word. They sat at the kitchen table. The same one Clara had once used to fold laundry and sort bills. Blake cupped his hands around a mug of coffee like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't waste time. "We've hit some unexpected complications," he began. "Devon's team is doing everything they can, but... well, the custom work you did, it's more complex than we realized." Logan said nothing, just raised an eyebrow slightly. Blake leaned forward, elbows on the table now, desperation showing through the cracks. "Some of the systems aren't syncing. Oncology lost access to treatment protocols for 6 hours. Billing verification crashed yesterday. We're losing control." Logan took a sip of his coffee, let the silence fill the space. "I'm prepared," Blake continued, "to offer you a 6-month contract, consultant status. Double your previous salary. We need you to help finish the transition." That was the moment, right there when the balance shifted, when Logan looked across the table, not at a powerful director, but at a man whose choices had finally come back to him. He let the offer hang in the air. Then said calmly, "I've already accepted another position." Blake blinked. "Where?" "Riverside Medical." Blake's fingers tightened around the mug. "They're our competitor." Logan nodded. "Yes." There was a long silence. Then Blake said it, the line people always reach for when they run out of strategy. "This is about revenge, isn't it?" Logan stood, walked slowly to the window. The rain was falling a little harder now, but his voice stayed even. This is about being where I'm valued, he said. It's about waking up and knowing the work I do matters, that I matter. Blake stood, too, frustration replacing desperation. You built these systems. You know them better than anyone. People are getting hurt. Logan turned, met his eyes, and I warned you. I told you the migration needed a transition plan. I told you what would break. But you didn't want truth. You wanted clearance. Blake opened his mouth, then shut it. There was nothing left to say. Logan walked him to the door. No anger, no bitterness, just clarity. As Blake stepped outside, he turned one last time. This isn't over. Logan didn't respond, just closed the door and stood there, still, not victorious, not smug, just steady, because it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about choosing himself. That afternoon, Logan received a call from Jennifer Walsh at Riverside, just a check-in before his start date. "You still on board?" she asked. Logan smiled. "Absolutely." There was something different in his voice, not sharp, not loud, just anchored. The kind of tone that comes from a man who's walked through fire and found his footing on the other side. He didn't tell her about the visit from Blake, didn't mention the contract offer or the desperation in the man's voice, because it didn't matter. Logan wasn't going back. Not because he couldn't, but because he finally realized he didn't need to. They had made their choice. Now he was making his. For 15 years, Logan had shown up for them, for the hospital, for the system. Now he was showing up for himself. And for the first time in a long, long while, that was more than enough. Sometimes the truth doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes with a news anchor's voice. Flat, controlled, just enough concern to seem human, but not enough to lose composure. Logan was sitting in his living room when it happened. Rain pattered against the windows, the kind of steady drizzle that made everything feel suspended in time. He had the television on, not for entertainment, not even for background noise, but out of habit. A way to keep the silence at bay without really breaking it. Then the broadcast changed. A breaking news banner slid across the bottom of the screen. The words, "System failures plague local hospitals," scrolled slowly, almost like they were trying to soften the blow. Logan didn't move. He didn't lean forward, didn't reach for the remote. He just watched. A reporter stood outside St. Joseph Medical Center, microphone in hand, speaking over footage of ambulances being diverted and nurses flipping through paper records. The camera cut to an emergency entrance where someone was arguing with a receptionist. Frustration, confusion, urgency all wrapped into one brief, shaky moment. The story unfolded in segments. Departments unable to access patient histories. Critical alerts going undelivered. Surgeries postponed due to scheduling glitches. And then, the line that landed with weight. Sources inside the hospital say the issues began shortly after a major overhaul of its IT infrastructure. Logan didn't react. His hands were still, resting on his knees. But his jaw tightened just slightly. He didn't need them to say his name. He didn't need credit. He knew what this was. A slow, quiet unraveling. And in that moment, the silence in his apartment grew deeper, not emptier, just heavier. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. Caller ID, Ellen Harper. He picked it up. Her voice came through, not rushed, not panicked, just low, honest. "You saw the news, didn't you?" Logan let out a breath. "Yeah. They've lost access to over 30% of archived patient data," she said. "The Helix platform couldn't integrate with legacy storage formats. Now they're trying to rebuild from backup, but even that's failing." There was a pause. "Today," she continued, "we had to divert a cardiac patient. Middle-aged man, mid-50s, history of arrhythmia. We didn't have his records. It took 30 minutes to confirm he couldn't take beta blockers." 30 minutes? Logan closed his eyes. Did he make it? "He's stable now," Ellen said. "But it was close, too close." He leaned back in the chair, feeling the wood creak under his weight. There was no joy in this, no vindication, only a kind of grim awareness. This wasn't what he wanted. Not even close. He had never wanted the system to fail. He had just wanted to be heard. Ellen went quiet for a second. Then she added, "Blake's team is scrambling. Helix has pulled their senior consultants in. There's talk of reversing some of the changes, temporary paper protocols. Internal investigations been launched. State regulators might get involved." Logan nodded slowly. He could almost hear Clara's voice in the back of his mind. You don't need to shout to be heard, just keep doing the right thing. They'll listen when it matters most. Maybe, maybe not. But right now, they were listening. The hospital that had called him obsolete was now calling for help. And not in words, in chaos, in silence, in systems breaking down one by one. Logan didn't offer advice, didn't say, I told you so. He just asked, what are you going to do? I'm going to the board, Ellen said, and I'm bringing them the whole story, the real one. The metrics Blake buried, the emails I found, the conversations I documented, they need to understand this wasn't an accident. Logan was quiet for a long time, then he said, be careful. I will, she replied, and then she paused. Logan, you know, the funny thing is none of this would have happened if you had been given a chair at the table. A real seat, not just a corner in the server room. He didn't respond, because she was right, but the truth doesn't always get an invitation. Sometimes it has to crash through the window. After the call ended, Logan turned off the TV. The rain was still falling outside, steady as ever. He walked into his bedroom and opened the drawer where he kept his old staff badge. St. Joseph Medical Center. Name. Photo. Title. Senior Systems Engineer. 15 years, he held it for a moment, then set it back down. It didn't mean nothing. It just didn't mean what he thought it did, not anymore. Later that night, another message lit up his phone. This one wasn't from a nurse or a tech or even Ellen. It was from the board. From someone he hadn't spoken to directly since the day they shook his hand and thanked him for all his years of service. Logan, we've become aware of the technical issues currently impacting hospital operations and would like to request your insight. Doctor, Harper has spoken highly of your expertise and believes your voice would be valuable in our emergency review session. If you're available to attend, the board would greatly appreciate your perspective. He stared at the message for a long time, not because he didn't know what to say, but because of everything it meant. This wasn't a job offer, it wasn't an apology, it was something quieter, a crack in the wall. A chance to speak, not to prove a point, but to protect the people he'd always cared about, not Blake, not Helix, but the ones still in those hallways. Still trying to keep the lights on while the wires frayed behind the scenes. Logan set the phone down without answering. He'd sleep on it. But somewhere in the stillness of that moment, something shifted in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. Because sometimes justice doesn't look like a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a chair pulled out for the person they thought they could do without. And sometimes the ones they tried to erase end up being the only ones who can save what's left. There's a kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention. It commands it. That's the silence Logan walked into on Friday morning. The boardroom at St. Joseph Medical Center wasn't unfamiliar, but this time it felt different. The air was still, expectant. A kind of tension that buzzed just beneath the surface. He arrived 15 minutes early. Not because he needed to, but because that's who he was. Always early. Always prepared. He took a seat near the far end of the long table, facing the projector screen, just like he had for years. Except back then, he'd be in the corner clicking through slides that nobody paid much attention to. Today, every chair was filled. Department heads, board members, a few faces he hadn't seen in months, and then Blake walked in. Logan saw it in his eyes right away, that stiff smile, the tight jaw. He hadn't expected Logan to show, but Logan didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply nodded once with the kind of calm that doesn't need to prove anything. Dr. Ellen Harper called the meeting to order. Her tone was firm, clear. We're here to discuss the ongoing system failures and the state of our partnership with Helix Solutions. But before we proceed, I've asked Mr. Logan Pierce to share his insight. He's graciously agreed to provide an assessment. All eyes turned toward him. Logan stood steady. He didn't raise his voice, didn't use big words. He didn't have to. He connected his laptop to the projector. On the screen behind him appeared a clean dashboard. System uptime logs, integration maps, compliance audit summaries, all documented, all time-stamped. He began simply. These systems weren't outdated, he said. They were customized. He clicked to the next slide, a list of interface bridges, manual overrides, protocol redundancies. I designed them around the people using them, around their needs, around what kept patients safe when automation failed. The room was still. He moved to the next chart. These are the audit results from the last fiscal year. 99.98% uptime, 0 critical failures, full compliance. He let the numbers sit for a moment. Then, slowly, methodically, he brought up the Helix compatibility report, the one Ellen had uncovered. He highlighted the conflicts: pharmacy system, incompatible; radiology data bridge, unsupported; legacy patient record format, unrecognized. These incompatibilities were known, Logan said. They weren't minor bugs, they were structural, and they weren't disclosed before the migration. Blake shifted in his seat, but Logan didn't look at him yet. He kept his gaze on the room. Helix's platform works best in brand new hospitals, he continued. On clean infrastructure. What we have here isn't clean. It's layered, adapted over years. That's what made it reliable. Someone cleared their throat. It sounded nervous. Logan turned to face Blake directly. And you knew that, didn't you? Blake sat up straighter. The assessment indicated, Logan interrupted. An assessment you personally oversaw. He brought up an email, one forwarded to him by a former colleague. Dated weeks before the rollout, from Blake to Helix. It read, "We will downplay legacy system performance in the board presentation. Language will focus on modernization urgency." The room fell quiet. Logan let it sit. "I didn't come here to blame," he said after a beat. "I came here to tell the truth. Because while you were chasing performance bonuses and polished narratives, nurses were handwriting patient notes. Doctors were treating emergencies without access to full histories. People almost died." He closed his laptop. "I built this system, not to last forever, but to serve until it could be safely replaced. What happened wasn't just poor planning, it was intentional erasure of knowledge, of memory, of care." He paused, then said quietly, "You didn't just fire an engineer, you removed the person who understood how everything breathed together." Dr. Harper broke the silence. "Thank you, Logan." She turned to the board. "We've heard enough." What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no shouting, just a vote, unanimous. Helix's contract would be terminated immediately, an emergency restoration team would be formed, and Blake would be placed on administrative leave pending further review. Logan didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply packed up his laptop and stood. Dr. Harper walked over as the others filtered out. "We have another proposal for you," she said, her voice low. "If you're willing to hear it." Logan looked at her for a long second, then nodded. "I'm listening." Later that afternoon, he stepped out into the sunlight. The air felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because, for the first time, someone had heard him. He didn't want revenge, he wanted recognition, not of his pride, but of the truth. That experience matters, that loyalty matters. That some things can't be replaced by newer, cheaper, or shinier. As he walked down those familiar steps, past the same nurse's station where he once stood in the shadows, he didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt seen. And after everything, that was enough. Not every return is a triumph. Sometimes it's a quiet step back into a space that once forgot you, but this time on your own terms. 3 weeks after that board meeting, Logan walked through the front entrance of St. Joseph Medical Center. No security escort, no cardboard box, no badge turned in under pressure. This time he wore a new ID clipped neatly to his jacket. Chief Technology Officer. He didn't smile when he passed through those halls. But he noticed how many people looked up, not just at him, but for him. He nodded at the familiar faces. Nurses who had once tiptoed around blinking monitors during overnight shifts. Techs who used to text him in panic and now just exhaled when he was near. Even Dr. Patel, who stopped mid-conversation in the hallway to offer a small, honest nod of respect. The transition wasn't easy. Helix had left a mess behind. Half-integrated systems, corrupted databases, authentication chains broken and scattered like frayed rope. There were files that wouldn't open, configurations overwritten with generic templates, weeks of damage that couldn't be undone overnight. But Logan didn't come back with a grudge. He came back with a plan. His new office wasn't larger than the last one. In fact, it was smaller. But this time it had windows. And more importantly, it had a door that stayed open. He didn't hire back the same team. He blended old and new. Veterans who had weathered the storms with him. Fresh talent eager to learn, including a young systems analyst named Sam Carter, bright, skeptical, and very much like Logan once was. Sharp-eyed but still unsure where trust belonged in a world of contracts and firewalls. Logan taught them, not just the code but the care behind it. He held sessions in the mornings. Not formal meetings, just time to walk the team through what made their systems work, not just on paper but in practice. The invisible logic of human error, the patchwork that had held the old infrastructure together not by miracle, but by understanding. And slowly, things started to breathe again. It wasn't glamorous. There were long nights, glitches, pushback from departments still traumatized by the Helix failure. But day by day, the hospital began to settle, and Logan didn't need applause. He just needed things to work. One evening, a little past 9, he was still in the server room when Nurse Jacobs knocked on the glass wall. She held up a mug, his old system whisperer cup. The one he thought he'd never see again. "We found it," she said, smiling. "In a box labeled MISC, thought you might want it back." He took it carefully, like it might still break. It felt heavier than before, but maybe it was just the weight of everything it meant. Back upstairs, the board had already approved his 5-year tech roadmap. A deliberate rebuild, not fast, not flashy, but real. Gradual modernization tailored to the hospital's needs, shaped by the people who'd lived through both sides of the failure. Real change, measured, rooted. The kind that lasts. As for Blake, he was gone, pursuing other opportunities, according to the announcement. Logan never asked where, never checked, not out of kindness, but because he no longer needed to follow someone else's story. He had his own to build. There were moments, of course. Late nights when he sat alone in his office, lights low, screens humming quietly. Moments when his mind wandered back to the days after he was let go, when silence felt like exile and recognition felt like a foreign language. He remembered what it felt like to be invisible. And it made him more aware of who was still unseen. He started checking in on people others forgot. Janitors who cleaned the server racks. Front desk workers who dealt with every glitch without knowing where to send the complaint. He asked questions. He took notes. He fixed things quietly, precisely, because that's who he was, and because now he could. This wasn't a revenge story, not in the way people expect. Logan didn't sabotage, he didn't gloat. He didn't use power to punish, he used it to repair. To remind people what good leadership looks like when it isn't fueled by ego. One morning, Sam knocked on his door, held up a tangled printout. "Protocol chains failing again on the emergency override," he said, exasperated. "I've tried everything, I don't get it." Logan didn't answer right away. He just motioned for Sam to sit. Then he pulled up a blank diagram on the screen. And for the next hour, they walked through the logic together. Not just the syntax, but the story, where the code came from. Why the exception was written in the first place. How patient flow changed during flu season and how that shift had demanded a patch that didn't exist in any manual. Sam was quiet after. Finally, he said, "This isn't just IT, is it?" Logan smiled just a little. "No," he said, "it's not." Later that week, as Logan was leaving for the day, a nurse caught him by the elevator. "Feels different," she said. "What does?" "The hospital," she replied. "Since you came back, it feels like it can breathe again." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. And when the elevator doors closed, he stood quietly, holding that moment the way he once held systems, gently, protectively, with more reverence than most would ever know. This was his return, not loud, not vengeful, but necessary. A quiet resurrection of trust, of dignity, of everything they thought they could replace. Logan hadn't needed to destroy anything. He just needed to outlast it. And now, with every hallway he walked, every system he touched, every younger voice he guided, he wasn't just rebuilding a hospital. He was restoring what never should have been broken. Some hands are rough from labor, others from time, and some from holding things no one else knew were fragile. Logan had those hands. Not because of age or effort, but because for 15 years he'd carried systems, people, routines, without ever dropping a single one. And now those same hands were building something new, only this time he wasn't doing it alone. The first few weeks back as CTO, Logan did more listening than speaking. He walked the halls slowly, sat in on morning briefings, not to correct, but to observe. He watched how the young techs moved, how departments responded, how people avoided eye contact when they didn't know the answer. And every time he saw a crack forming in someone's confidence, he didn't point it out. He simply filled it in. That's how it was with Sam Carter. Sam was 26, bright, fast with numbers, faster with code, but green in the way that makes you think speed can replace wisdom. He reminded Logan of himself, back before he learned patience was a kind of power. Sam made mistakes, at first small ones. A mismatched protocol tag that threw off pharmacy reporting. Then a more serious one, an override test that hadn't been sandboxed properly, which almost triggered a real-time alert to state compliance. Sam owned up to it, nervous, sweating through his button-down. Logan said nothing at first, just stared at the monitor. Long enough to make the silence uncomfortable, then he leaned back and said quietly, "Good." Sam blinked. "Good, you made a mistake," Logan said. "Now you know what it feels like." Sam didn't know whether to nod or apologize again. Logan continued, "Don't ever try to cover it. That's how the real damage happens." From that moment on, Sam sat closer, took more notes, asked more questions. He stopped trying to impress and started trying to understand. That's when Logan knew the rebuild wasn't just technical, it was generational. He wasn't just restoring a system. He was passing down a way of thinking. The hospital, too, was changing. You could feel it in the tempo of things. The pharmacy interface ran smoother. Lab results synced without delay. Emergency overrides, once glitchy, now triggered exactly as designed. But the change wasn't just in the code. It was in the people. The janitor who once whispered thank yous now greeted Logan by name. A nurse left a post-it on his door that read, "Feels like the hospital again. Thank you." And Logan, who'd spent so long unnoticed, now couldn't walk 10 feet without a nod, a wave, a quiet thank you that came without ceremony. He didn't take credit. He gave it away. In one meeting, when the board praised the IT department's fast stabilization, Logan redirected the spotlight to Sam and Denise. "They're the reason the data recovery only took 10 days, he said. "I just gave them the room to do it right." Leadership for Logan wasn't about control anymore. It was about trust, and he had learned that trust, once broken, doesn't return quickly, but when it does, it feels like sunlight after a long winter. There was one night deep in December when Logan stayed late. The halls were quiet. Holiday lights blinked faintly in the corners of the nurses' stations. A skeleton crew kept the hospital running while most staff got some well-earned rest. Sam walked into the server room just after midnight, hair messy, jacket half-zipped. "You're still here?" he asked. Logan didn't look up from the console. "Could ask you the same." Sam handed him a coffee, lukewarm but thoughtful. "I was thinking," he said, "about earlier, that failover test you walked me through, the manual reboot step. No one documents stuff like that anymore." Logan nodded. "Because it's not in the software, it's in the rhythm." Sam sat across from him, quiet for a beat. Then he asked, "How do you know so much of this without looking it up?" Logan smiled. "Because I lived it." There was no pride in his tone, just truth. The kind that settles in your spine over years, not semesters. Sam was quiet again. Then he said, "I want to learn like that, not just do the job, I want to understand it." Logan leaned back in his chair, watching this kid, not as a replacement or a threat, but as something far more important. "A continuation." "You will," he said, not with encouragement, with certainty. Because Sam wasn't the only one learning. Logan was, too. He was learning that the role he held now wasn't just about fixing things. It was about leaving something behind. Not lines of code, but a philosophy. A way of showing up. A kind of quiet strength that didn't demand applause, but couldn't be ignored. That winter, the hospital was nominated for a Regional Tech Excellence Award. The nomination mentioned remarkable recovery and internal leadership after a failed enterprise migration. Logan never told anyone about the email he got from the review committee asking for a personal interview. He declined. Let the team take the spotlight, because this chapter wasn't about being seen, it was about seeing others. That was the real game now, not climbing ladders, but making sure the next person didn't fall off the one you just finished building. And as Logan left the hospital that night, snow falling in soft layers over the lot, he paused by the main entrance, watched the lights reflect off the glass. He wasn't the man they once overlooked. He was the man who'd quietly returned, rebuilt, and lifted others with him. The same hands that once held a hospital together in silence were now building something even more powerful, a culture, a legacy, a future. There are moments that don't announce themselves, no music, no fanfare. Just stillness, the kind that makes you pause and see. Logan sat on his back deck that evening, a cup of coffee cradled between both hands, steam rising slow and thin in the fading light. It was one of those quiet Midwest nights, air cool, sky painted in soft streaks of pink and gold, the world exhaling after another long day. On the table beside him sat a small plastic card, nothing fancy. Just a white hospital badge, his name, his photo, his title, Chief Technology Officer. He picked it up, ran his thumb across the edge, not out of pride, out of reflection. The kind that comes when you realize the road you thought was over had just taken a turn you never expected. It wasn't the title that meant something, it was what it cost to get there, not just the job loss. Not just the betrayal, but the silence afterward, the stillness, the questioning. Logan had once believed his value was tied to how useful he was, how quietly he could hold a system together while others took the stage. Now, for the first time, he realized, his value had never been in being invisible. It had been in enduring, not out of stubbornness, but out of purpose. The hospital had changed. Yes, the systems were stable, the staff calmer, the future brighter, but that wasn't what stayed with him most. What stayed were the moments no one saw. The post-it notes on his door from nurses after a long night. The quiet nods in the hallway from techs who used to avoid eye contact. The rookie who'd once tried to prove himself with speed, now asking thoughtful questions and waiting for the full answer. Those weren't just signs of a repaired infrastructure. They were signs of trust, of respect, of something deeper than efficiency, belonging. Logan leaned back in his chair, the badge resting on the table again. He wasn't holding it anymore, because he didn't need to. Recognition had come, not as a trophy, but as a quiet shift in how others saw him, and how he saw himself. He thought about Clara. About the nights she used to sit on that same deck, her scarf draped loose over her shoulders, even in the summer, like she was holding something close that the world couldn't quite touch. She used to say, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build into others so they can carry it forward." And now, looking back, Logan realized that's exactly what he'd done, not just rebuilt systems, but passed on steadiness. Care, a kind of leadership that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. His phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer Walsh at Riverside. Heard St. Joseph received the Regional Excellence Award. Congratulations. Almost colleague Logan smiled, typed back, "Thanks, sorry again for the last-minute change of plans." Her reply came fast. "No hard feelings, you're where you were meant to be." And she was right. Logan didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see Blake fall or Helix flounder. He needed this. A place where his hands weren't just fixing things, they were shaping the future. He stood up from the chair, stretched slowly. The stars had started to show, faint pinholes above the quiet neighborhood. He picked up the badge again, slid it into his jacket pocket, not like armor, but like a reminder. A small, plastic symbol of a truth that couldn't be unlearned. That's sometimes the most powerful kind of justice, is simply being trusted again. Not because you shouted louder, but because you stayed, you waited, you kept showing up even when they didn't. And now, when people walk those halls and the systems work and the data flows and the screens blink just as they should, they won't know all the names behind it, but they'll know someone cared enough to do it right, to do it the long way, The hard way. The human way. Logan doesn't need them to know it was him. He just needs them to feel what it means to be safe, to be supported, to belong. That's the legacy. That's what lasts. And that's the quiet power of a man who was once thrown away, but never, not for 1 second, stopped holding the world together.